this week I made Clone Leo from the Armageddon game from the new IDW TMNT comics, and I'm going to show you how I did it. So to start out, I put him in some recently boiled water and leave him there for a minute as I drink my coffee, and then I twist off his bandana and I cut off the belt, and it's easier when it's soft and warm. And now I'm using my cordless Dremel to sand off his mask and his face, well, his cheeks. It's going to keep the rest of his face, but it's going to be covered by a bandana, the bottom half. Anyway, then I move on to a nail file to clean it up and finish the job. That's another head for what I'm working on for next week, and I'll talk about that. But first I fill in all the cracks with some spackling, and then that dries after like 15-20 minutes, and I can easily sand it with my nail file there. Now I'm using the Dremel to sand off most of his knee pads and elbow pads, and yeah, finishing that with the nail file. And I use green stuff to give him some eyeballs, because he's just going to be a plain turtle head with no mask on, and so it takes a while to knead the yellow and blue together to make the green stuff. And then I'm using my silicone shaping tools to shape the pieces of green stuff that I put on to get pants and a round knee pad and round elbow pads. So that's what these guys have, the clone turtles. Now I'm trying to make some molds, and this is a plumber's putty. I have this is the actual silicone putty that you're supposed to make the molds out of, and it's two parts and you mix them together. But the plumber's silicone putty was like $8 cheaper, and you don't have to mix it together, so I thought I'd try that and see how it works. But for the head I'm using the good stuff, so I'm making a two-part mold. So I put the bottom of his head up to like where the mask would have been, and then I put some toothpicks in there to make some holes for registration marks for when I add the top half. But first I spray mold release, because otherwise the silicone would just stick to the silicone and it would be stuck in there. And now it comes off, and because I put those marks, I know how it lines up. And I made a couple other molds, and this is stuff for next week's video, but I wanted to try this stuff out. And I'm also making some size for this Leo, because this Leo has size. That was hard to say. This is a polyurethane resin I'm using, and it's two parts. You mix the catalyst with the polyester resin, and then you stir it, and it takes like a day or two to dry, and it really smells. But then I move on the next day. I do the top of his pants, and I waited a day for the legs to dry, because otherwise you keep touching them and squishing them and messing them up. So now we're back to the resin, well, the molds at least. So I left these overnight, but they didn't really harden at all. But then I tried to do a two-part with the swords. I don't know how that's gonna work. And I want to make some proper ones for the size, because the clone Leo has size rather than a sword in the new Armageddon game series where these clone turtles are. Now I'm using a UV resin, and to get out the bubbles I use the lighter, and they just pop when you heat them up. And I'm pouring it into the new molds, and this is a resin that it's only one part, and I mixed in some dye for a little bit of color, and then you just hold the UV light over it and it cures that way. But I didn't know when I bought this light, every 60 seconds it turns off and you have to turn it back on, and that's good for like a small thin thing. But as I learned from this first pour, it takes a lot longer for it to get through to the bottom. But then I move back on to the figure, because now he's ready to get some spackling to fill all the cracks and the spots that are crackling. And as that dries, I move on. I try again. I went too much resin the first time, and I thought it would be easy to sand off, but the UV resin's not that easy to sand, at least it wasn't for me. And I just keep clicking the light while I do some sanding and adding the matte acrylic varnish to help the paint stick to everything, and then just keep tapping that light every time it goes off. And I move on to a hunter green, which is, well, I'll get back to that because I forgot I need to put some white primer to do the whites in his eyes whiter, and his teeth were dirty even though you're not going to see them. Now I'm back to the hunter green, and this green in particular, it kind of matches the green stuff, so it's going to make everything match, all the white spackling parts and the light green parts that I didn't touch and the green stuff to get my base. And I want to have a darker base. All these guys I did the same because I already made Mikey, Donnie, and Raph previously, and so these ones came out better with less resin in the mold because I had pushed the size pretty deep when I was making the mold with intentions of just getting on the inside, but then I forgot when I was pouring. And now I'm on to burnt umber I'm using for the first layer on all his gear, his pants, his pads, his wraps, his chest cracks. And now raw sienna, I'm just lightly covering the chest with that, trying not to get in the cracks. Now I'm dry brushing it all over the shell, getting just a little bit of paint on the brush and then taking most of it off and just spreading it around till it gets on all the edges and starts to bring out all the details. Then I move on to a daffodil yellow, which is a light yellow, and I'm dry brushing a lot more, and well, I'm dry brushing less, but it's going to really pick up the details. Then I'm dry brushing cinnamon brown on the pants so that all the lines and stuff that I made pop out and it gives some highlights and some shadows. Then nickel azo gold is just a random paint I have. I think it's by Golden Acrylics, and when I put it on top of brown, I think it looks like brown leather, so I like to use it to make leathery looking parts. Now I'm doing another coat of the matte acrylic varnish to cover everything I painted so it's all ready to go and doesn't smudge or scratch while I'm working. I have a glow yellow that I'm using for the eyes, and I'm gonna put probably 5 coats of that, just light coats on the eyes to really make them glow. And I have a grass green for the, well, I'm doing all his skin in the grass green, but I'm just going lightly because I want the darker to still kind of show a little, and especially in the cracks and grooves and details. Then I have synthetic leather that I just cut a strip for his belt, and I just use super glue to wrap that around and glue it down. Then I have these little pouches I made. I made them in the in the Raph and Donnie video, and I'll put a link to that at the end, but they're really easy, just out of 2 different thicknesses of foam. In a stainless steel wire tie I cut a little piece of to do the belt buckle. Now I have, it's just an old white t-shirt that I cut out the basic shape of his bandana that's going to be wrapped around his face. But it's a little big, so I trim off a little more until I get it how I want it. And then I didn't glue it down, I just tied a double knot on the back there, and he's all done. That's how I did it. Next week and the rest of October is going to be all Universal Monster TMNT. That's what I did last year. I'm going to do it again, but 4 different monsters, and that head and stuff is going to be in next week's video. So until then, remember, always keep your head up. Peace.